Okay. Welcome to the Mayflower Promise 2020 conference. We are now joined by Professor Emeritus Dr. Charles Glenn of Boston University. The title of his remarks are An Old Injustice to Correct. Dr. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us, and we are looking forward to hearing your remarks.
It's my pleasure. When we use the term injustice these days, we're usually thinking about race. I understand and agree, but we need to widen our definition to include injustice based on indifference and even hostility to deeply held religious convictions. I spent the first 30 years of my adult life dealing with racial injustice in the US, first as a community activist in the Black community in Boston in the 60s, when I also supported the freedom movement in the South and spent some time in jail in North Carolina and walked across that bridge in Selma with Dr. King and hundreds of other people. And then I was the Massachusetts state official responsible for racial justice in schools from 1970 to 1991. So I know something about racial justice. I spent the second 30 years of my active life dealing with religious injustice, both here and abroad. This has included publishing information on how more than 60 countries accommodate religious convictions in their educational systems or fail to do so, and working with evangelical and Catholic schools and education leaders. My most recent book is about how Islamic high schools across the United States work to create American citizens. And my most recent published work is about how Orthodox Jewish schools in Europe are being pressured by government. In short, I've been involved in a lot of these issues. I've served as an expert witness in a number of cases across the country, challenging official prejudice against faith-based schools. This second struggle for justice seems to me as fundamental as the first. As with race, there's been an old injustice about religion to correct. And we're making progress in both cases, but there are also new injustices to guard against and to confront. The old injustice against Black Americans involved, as everyone knows, laws and administrative practices that discriminated against them and limited in a whole variety of ways their successful participation in American society. While these had their roots in the system of slavery, they were reinvented after emancipation in the so-called Jim Crow laws, practices across the South. They were also imposed more subtly but powerfully in a wide range of government and economic practices in the rest of the country. Real estate redlining, the drawing of attendance zones and feeder patterns for schools and for housing in order to prevent racial mixing. Dismantling these structural injustices began most notably with the 1954 Brown decision of the Supreme Court and continued through countless legal and political battles for the next 30 years. They were the focus of my own work in the 70s and into the 80s in Massachusetts and as a consultant across the country. During the same years, the 1870s, the 1880s, when the Jim Crow laws were being put in place to discriminate against Black Americans, another set of laws and court decisions were being put in place to discriminate against Catholic Americans. At a time when state after state was requiring that children be sent to school, state after state was also forbidding the use of public funds to make it possible for Catholic parents to send their children to schools that corresponded to their own convictions. This, at a time continuing until the middle of the 20th century, when the public schools themselves had a predominantly Protestant character. During the post-war years, when official racial discrimination was being challenged with increased success. This religious discrimination against Catholics was actually broadened by a series of Supreme Court decisions, removing the residual Protestant aspects of public schooling, including prayers and Bible reading. Children would be educated on the basis of a completely secularistic and materialistic understanding of the world. Here we need to make a distinction that is too often missed between instruction and education. Instruction is the teaching of skills and knowledge, the sorts of things that we test. And education is the formation of character, of convictions, of a settled disposition to act in a consistent way. Every school, as well as homeschooling, provides both, though sometimes the education provided, since it is not going to be tested, is unintended and confused, and may even be harmful in some cases. Schools whose mission is based on an implicit set of beliefs, whether religious or pedagogical, philosophical, are typically concerned to provide education consistent with those beliefs, as well as instruction in knowledge and skills. Surveys show that this aspect of what those schools do is an important factor for parents in choosing them, even if, as in some cases with urban Catholic schools, the parents don't share the religious identity of the school. These schools are free to promote a distinctive understanding of the world and of the nature of a flourishing human life because they've been chosen voluntarily by the parents who want their children exposed to that perspective. Public schools that enroll their pupils on the basis of involuntary assignment, and here I'm not including, for example, charter schools, which are also public schools, but they're voluntary, are not or should not be free to educate based on such a distinctive perspective. To do so would be to violate the consciences of the pupils and their families. These are government institutions, and it's appropriate, indeed essential, that our government institutions be religiously neutral. It's very inappropriate, however, for government schools to be secularistic in the sense of promoting a worldview that dismisses all claims based upon religious convictions, unless chosen by parents who seek such a materialistic education for their children. Given the rich diversity of opinions among the American people, the only system of schooling permitting schools to provide a coherent education, in addition to instruction in skills and knowledge, would be one that is structurally pluralistic. Government would permit schools based on a variety of religious convictions or pedagogical strategies, giving them ample space to express their distinctive mission within a framework of accountability for academic outcomes. Government would provide public funding for all such schools on an equal basis so that parents do not pay a financial penalty, as at present, for choosing a school based upon their convictions about what is best for their own children. Is that an unrealistic ideal? Not at all. It describes accurately the situation in the Netherlands, in fact, most Western democracies. In the Netherlands, for example, only about 30% of the school children attend schools that are religiously neutral because they're under government operation. The other schools all have a distinctive character. In the Netherlands and other countries, government provides public funding on the basis of what schools parents want their children to attend. And one of the positive features of that is the Dutch, for example, have much less conflict over schooling than we do in the United States. We've been making significant progress towards such a situation in the United States as a result of legislative action in a number of states and decisions by the Supreme Court, most recently the Espinoza decision. But there continue to be significant barriers to religious justice in American education. I might insert here that I've been expert witness in a number of those cases that have sought to remove the unfair burden upon faith-based schools. And I'm cited in one of the opinions in the Espinoza case. The most obvious barrier to racial justice in American education is the entrenched and bitter opposition of the teacher unions and other vested interests in the present system of public school quasi-monopoly. The interest of parents in fundamental reform of an unjust system is much more difficult to mobilize. The other, more subtle but powerful barrier is the disdain toward religious convictions, so evident among our cultural elites. This includes a deeply held belief that religious schooling prevents youth from becoming autonomous and thus authentic through growing out of the loyalties and convictions which they experience in their families. Thus, for example, Myra Levinson at the Harvard School of Education insists that, and I'll quote her, "The state is justified in training children to develop the capacity for autonomy, even against parents' and children's expressed wishes." And she dismisses what she calls the misapprehension that liberalism requires the state to be neutral among competing conceptions of the good. Religious schools, from this perspective, should be permitted only if they do not seek to promote their convictions about the good life. Nor is hostility to religious schooling uniquely American. In today's email, I have a message from Britain's National Secular Society, not sure how I got on their mailing list, urging my support for their campaign, No More Faith Schools, and including an article charging that, quote, Scotland's faith schools are a divisive anachronism. Although millions of British parents choose schools with a religious identity for their children, schools that are government funded, and academic achievement in these schools is at least as good as that in the government operated schools. The very existence of schools with a distinctive religious character is deeply offensive to supporters of the National Secular Society, and I should add, to our own cultural elites. It's no exaggeration to say that anti-religious prejudice is as deeply rooted as anti-Black prejudice, and unlike the latter, is freely acknowledged in elite circles today. So we have a double challenge as we confront religious injustice. There is the political challenge of mobilizing enough popular support for parental choice of schools to counter the entrenched opposition on the part of the public education establishment. And there is the cultural challenge of calling out anti-religious prejudice for the bigotry that it is and promoting an alternative vision based on respect for a pluralism of reasonable beliefs. It is as we take on these challenges that we will show ourselves worthy of the heritage of the Mayflower pilgrims who came seeking freedom to live out their deepest convictions.